Hi, everyone. I'm BJ. I'm a genealogist and librarian here in Maine. And tonight I'm going to talk about naturalization and how it's been done over the course of the last 250 years or so here in the US. And basically, the big date you need to remember for this is 1906. Before 1906, any court in the country could naturalize somebody. In 1906, the federal government takes over and it has to go through the federal process. Um, the assumption I often work with people working under that everyone automatically naturalized as soon as they were eligible. And that's not true. That's especially not true here in Maine. People who are Canadian citizens and going back and forth across the border. A lot of people stayed one side or the other of the border, and that was it. But you also get people who come to the US from New Brunswick, from Quebec, and never naturalize. Live here 50 years and never bother to become citizens. Essentially, up until about the 1970s, let's say, and even a little later in places like northern Maine, the big difference between a citizen and a non-citizen was, could you vote? You know, I remember when I was starting to work at jobs in the 1980s, they were just starting to check your paperwork about whether you were qualified to work in the US. And I expect some of you remember getting jobs when you were in the 70s where you didn't have to show any paperwork that you were a US citizen. Um, and as I said, especially in places like northern Maine, where there was so much back and forth and people knew each other, it was a little slower up there. I know somebody who is about my age who got his first jobs up in northern Maine without, because he was in a town where he was related to half of them and went to school with anybody he wasn't related to. So, you know, he got a job at the grocery store without having to prove that he was a US citizen because everybody knew him. Um, I expect there are still some small towns in various parts of the country where they just sort of check off because they remember when this kid was born and they don't bother to get the paperwork. Um, but so that's something to remember because people assume they're going to find naturalization paperwork for their immigrant ancestors, and you may not. And there are other reasons you may not that we'll get to. But I just wanted to remind you that that was something many people did. They didn't bother. There was a cost involved. There may have been having to go to a distant port. There were places you would have lived in, the Midwest Great Plains where it might have been a couple hour or more trip to the county seat. Well, was it worth taking a couple of days off to do this? If the only difference was whether you could vote or not, maybe you didn't bother. If you're a farmer out in Kansas, or even a farmer here in rural Maine. I am going to talk about one way where land does encourage people to naturalize. So, like with immigration, I'm going to go through some of the changes and how things were done, and then I'm going to show you the documents that were generated. So, at the time of the American Revolution, basically what happened when the Constitution passed in 1789, basically anyone living in the US at that point who was, because of the way the system worked, free and white, was a US citizen. The first actual law about how to naturalize came about in 1795. If you were free white of good moral character, you'd lived in what was now the US for 5 years with 1 year in the state you're in. So you couldn't you know, live somewhere for 5 years, move, and then 3 weeks after you move, apply. You had to wait another year. And then what happened was you did a declaration of intent, and then 3 years later, you were actually naturalized. 3 years later, they changed that to 14 years residency instead of 5, with 5 years between the declaration and the naturalization. But in 1802, they went back to 5 years. And for the first time, explicitly said that the minor children of naturalized citizens, became citizens when their father did. Shortly after that, there was also a law passed that if a man died between asking for citizenship and being naturalized, his widow and minor children were granted citizenship. And that's it for a bit. And it's really only the next big change is in 1855. Women who were not US citizens, who married a citizen, automatically became a citizen until 1922, when they became a citizen, and that status, that change was then in place until 1922. It's not that their citizenship ended in 1922. Now we get to the one where land ownership does have an effect. The Homestead Act of 1862 that gave 160 acres to somebody who lived on the land and improved it for 5 years. You had to be a citizen to get that land. And so you do see a bunch of people in the 1860s. I've seen a bunch of people who had been here a while, because the other thing that happens is those who fought for the Union in the Civil War, if they were honorably discharged, they could immediately apply for and get naturalization. They didn't have to, the veterans didn't have to wait that 5-year period. So between those two things, there is an uptick in naturalizations in the 1860s, especially of people who've been here a while, because the process has been made easier if they're a veteran, or relevant and valuable if they want land out west. So then the next thing, things held pretty steady for a while until you get that 1906 change to standard requirements around the country, the federal government taking over things. Some of this is under the Treasury Department. Some of it's under other departments. There's not much we need to talk about there. The one big thing is in 1907, it was explicitly made law that if an American woman, a US citizen woman, married someone who was not a citizen, she lost her citizenship. And that law was in effect until 1922. You get continuing bits of legislation or regulation that make it very hard or essentially impossible for people of Asian descent to become US citizens. You've got a long period there where Japanese and Chinese people who had come to this country could not become citizens. Then in 1922, the law changes so that women's citizenship is separated from their husbands. So they no longer lose it if they marry a non-citizen, and they have to be naturalized on their own account and not just because their husband naturalized. And if any of you remember your school history, the fact that that's in 1922, and if you remember, I said earlier that the big difference between a non-citizen and a citizen at this point is voting. The passage of the amendment allowing women to have the right to vote was 1920. So you can see why Congress at that point split a woman's citizenship from her husband's, because it now mattered. Does that make sense to everybody? Then you get other changes. Most of what I'm going to talk about is pre World War II, because things do change after World War II, but most of those records are still considered private, so we're not going to find them. In some cases, we see up to the 50s, because when things were microfilmed in the 80s, people decided that up to the early 50s was okay. But just so you know that the modern process, things change in the late 50s through the 1960s, and then they keep changing. And I'm not getting into the modern stuff, because if you probably knew that person well enough to know when they became a citizen, and they would, I hope, if they're still alive, have their paperwork, because probably need it. So that's sort of the overview. And essentially, it's like with everything else we talk about. Early on, it's pretty loose. Um, it's done so that people can do it at a local court. You could go to a county court if you lived in a big county, so you didn't have to worry about, you know, having to go to, you know, capital. I mean, state capital. You think about it with, Maine in 1900. If you lived in Aroostook County and you would have had to come to the capital to become a citizen, even fewer people than actually did it would have bothered, because it would have been a 2 or 3 day trip. And the um, benefit of voting would not have um, been worth it. Oops, I just hit the wrong thing. Trying to get my so that's what is going on here. Why is this not working? One, that's why. Wait, I just hit something wrong. My apologies. So now I'm going to let's take a look at the documents you're likely to see. One more thing, and then we'll be ready. Okay, so let's take a look at these documents. So this is pretty typical from, late 1900, late 1800s on, declaration to become citizen. And the information you get on this, you get the person's name and age. And a physical description, where they were born. And this is one of the reasons you may want to look at these things. You rarely, Canada, you often get something more than the province. And I have found in Ireland, you usually get the county, and it's about not quite 50-50 that you're going to get something more than that. Exact birth date, where they live. So he's living in Sanford. When he came to the US, and he came by rail, last place he lived, which looks like it's the same place he was born. He's not married, so not that information. Where they got, where he came, so he came in through Vermont, and when. By this time, if someone comes by ship, they often did check that. They went back and will, you to double check that. He says he's not an anarchist or a polygamist, and he wants to become a citizen of the US. And you'll notice here, and I'll show you an example later, at this point, he's saying he wants to become a citizen. He has to act on this within 7 years to do the second step and actually be naturalized, or he needs to start the process over. That's one reason I pulled this one, because it's got this right here at the top. So you can't say you missed it. And generally, this is the signature of the person. So this tells us he's at least able to write his name, even if he isn't really literate. Here's an earlier one. This is just before this. This is 1902. So just before the federal government takes over it. And the Supreme Judicial Court of the state of Maine is naturalizing Sigismund Coty of Biddeford, born at St. Sophie in the province of Quebec on this date. And so you're getting the same information, but it's through the state court. And I wanted you to see how, and one of the things you'll find is that before the 1906, the state and local court files are harder to find. Many of them either have not been digitized. Many of them haven't even been microfilmed. I know when I was at the state library, one of my coworkers went and got a bunch of stuff from a county hall cellar that included a bunch of naturalizations for that county that were not recorded anywhere else other than in the state of Maine. It was notUte County. And my understanding is it's those on the list to be digitized. But with so many of these things, you really need to almost forget how it's done in the modern world, or you'll get very frustrated that you're not finding something. Here's one in Massachusetts. To Dennis Murphy. He's a baker. He's an alien and a free white person, and this is in 1858. So free white person is actually a relevant distinction at that point. And they had enough Irish people in Massachusetts, I guess, becoming citizens that they had it pre-printed about Victoria not having to write in her name. And they printed it with some of these with her name in it. So that's the sort of, this is one going back before the Civil War. Here's another one in 1858. Actually, sorry, this is the next stage for Dennis. He's living in so we have this one where he's saying he's of Cambridge. Here he is. He's a laborer, same thing. This one tells us, unlike this one, that he was from the county of Cork. The first one just said Ireland. And so on. So you have that. So again, you get the two levels. And then here's a John Murphy. And you'll see this is later. This is in 1915. So it's when the federal government has taken things over. So it's federal district court, still in Massachusetts, but it's the federal court. And this is when the courts are still doing it and not a naturalization office of the federal government the way it is now. But again, you get his occupation, age, physical. He was born in County Sligo, which at least gives you and has an exact birth date. He's not married. By this time, George V is king. And you see that when he arrived, here's the petition. And again, you have various bits of the information. You've got his two witnesses. Sometimes these are people right off the street, but it looks like they're from Newton and Newton Center, and he's living in Newton at the time of this one. So I would guess that these are people he brought with him. And so you'd want to see how close they actually lived. And you'll notice that Thomas O'Loughlin is a molder, and he gives his occupation for iron molder. So I'm guessing they work together or work together at some point, which, given all the John Murphys there would have been in Massachusetts at this time period, it's maybe not that there aren't also several, I expect, Thomas O'Loughlin's, but at least it gives you two names together to look for. Backside of that one. And then you can see here, this is the confirming that when he did actually arrive. So on the Adriatic. And so if we go back here, it should say somewhere. Yeah, there it is with on the vessel Adriatic in 1915. So you can see how they were checking that people came starting in the 19 teens. So here it says, for the use of aliens arriving in the U.S. after June 29th, 1906. That's when you get, when the ports all start using the same form. And before that, they didn't. And so it was really hard to check. And so this is a different John Murphy because he's from County Kerry. But again, you see this one is from 1857. So again, you get the free white person. And he paid all of the money that it cost, which, my feeling that records about money tend to be generated and kept. So and then here's one. This is a bit later. This is a woman. So it's after 1922. And you'll notice this can be really helpful. It lists all of her children. And on a lot of these, you will, men and women, you will get all of their children listed. It gives her husband's name, the date they were married, where they were married, where the spouse was born, and when the spouse came to the US, if they did. So, and the other thing you notice here, it's often the declaration and not the final petition that has the details. Often the final petition is very much just name, current residence and occupation, revocation of their old citizenship, and that they've become a US citizen. These details about family or the person applying are usually on the declaration of intent and not the final naturalization. Does that make sense to you? You know, the idea is that you put that stuff on the first on the application. This declaration is essentially an application, and then you then they have the authorization for the naturalization. But again, you see this is in the federal district court. This is interesting. This is one from 1912, and it is a case where Catherine Teresa Leahy, age 31, is applying for her own citizenship. And you'll notice here where it doesn't ask, it adds that she's unmarried. Tells you what county she was born in Ireland, physical description. And then again, on the second page, you get she's not married. But that's why she is actually applying, because since she wasn't married, she hadn't become a citizen by either marrying an American citizen or marrying a man who became a citizen after they got married. But it does give her exact day of birth and at least the county. Here's one. So we have Stanislaw Bazalewicz. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. He's a shoemaker. He's from Russia, born on the 10th of November, 1880, living in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and is going to renounce forever all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, blah, blah, blah. Nicholas II, Emperor of all the Russias. So this is 1913. Well, it looks like he didn't do anything with it, because here we have 1924, and he's had to start the process all over again. And here we have him, Stanislaw. He's now 43 instead of 32. He's still a shoemaker. You get the 10th of November, 1880. Still living in Chelsea. By now, asking about spouse, and by this point, it's the present government of Russia instead of Tsar Nicholas II. And so I couldn't find a. It looks like he changed. He ended up going by the name Stephen in the U.S., and I didn't find that whether he'd followed through this time. So don't be surprised. This sort of thing happened where somebody made the declaration and suddenly it's 9 years later, and that's after that 7 years. So they had to start all over again. Does that make sense to everybody? Why, don't panic if you find what it looks like somebody did it twice. It's not like they had their citizenship revoked and they had to apply again. It's just, they stuck the declaration in a drawer and 7 years goes by awfully quickly sometimes. So this is an interesting one. This is actually my grandparents. I cut it off so you could actually see this. This is the 1930 census. Yeah, 1930. And so you see, this is my grandfather. And I'm going to show you this because it helps sometimes figure out when somebody naturalized. So 1923 was when my grandfather came to the US for the second time that became his permanent home. He'd been here earlier, went to Canada, went back to Scotland, went back to Canada, went back to Scotland, came back to the US. So PA in this case means he's filed his first papers. He's filed that intention. My grandmother came in 1924. she's still an alien, hasn't done anything towards becoming a citizen. And then this is her brother who lived with them the rest of his life. And after both of my grandparents died, continued to live with one of my aunts until he died. And Uncle Jim had come over about the same time Grandma Jameson did, a couple months later. And he has also filed his first papers, as it was often called. That's the declaration or the application. So then 10 years later, we've got my grandfather naturalized. My grandmother is still an alien. And Uncle Jim still has his papers pending. Now he's got a problem. It's 10 years. If he either has already renewed that in, that intention, or he says he's got his papers pending, and if he wants to do anything about it, he's got to go in and do what Stanislaw had to do of reapplying, redeclaring. But I like this one because it shows the three adults in the household who were born outside the US. These are the three statuses you can have on the 20th century censuses that for people who were born outside the US. So it's naturalized, alien, and then papers pending. In other words, still an alien, but working towards being naturalized, actively working. And then looking 10 years later, my grandfather has died. My grandmother has become a citizen. And you notice here, they're not asking about status anymore. This one, they asked about, they were told to do these 3 levels, but by 1950, sorry, going the wrong way there. By 1950, it's a yes or no naturalized question. It's not where are you in the process? It's are you a citizen or are you not a citizen? So I think Uncle Jim finally did at some point become a citizen, but as of 1950, he hadn't. But my grandmother had by this point. So what happened if you didn't become a citizen? For the most part, as I said earlier, up until about the 1960s or 70s, it didn't matter that much, except for voting, the Homestead Act, which I talked about, and alien registration during wars. This is a book that has transcribed the alien registrations. In other words, these are people who are not US citizens, they're British citizens during the War of 1812. And so here we have my several greats grandfather, Robert Restio, who's a tailor in Boston, his wife, Catherine, and then their children. Louise is my several greats grandmother, Williams, blah, 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 all born in the US. And then there's also a Jonathan Bradley Bellows and a Nathaniel Mason Lang. So these are non-American citizens living in the US. This is a book that has been put into Ancestry. I don't know if you can actually see the original, but the book is a reasonably good transcription. So if you have what you think are fairly recent immigrants in your family for the War of 1812 from the UK, which at this point included Ireland, you may want to take a look and see if they're in there. But as you can see, they don't have much detail, but they have some. Often with a estimated arrival year, which is, and then this is the date that um, the information was given. Then here's an interesting one. This is an alien registration of Edith Holzhauer, who was born in Kansas in 1886. So if she's born in Kansas, why is she registering as an alien? I know some of you have seen this one before. So any guesses as to why she has an alien registration during the First World War? She married a non-citizen. She's married to Charles Holzhauer, who is still a German citizen. He had not naturalized as of this point. And so, as far as I can tell, she really never left Kansas. But she married someone who came to the US as a child and hadn't naturalized. But they're married in, she's born in Kansas. They're married in Kansas. She has 5 kids in Kansas at this time this was done. And she has to go in and be fingerprinted as an enemy alien at the time of World War I. How's that for the law working?
Are her children citizens?
Her children are citizens because they were born here. So that's that's like the cherry on top of the insult Sunday, right? Because her kids are citizens. And if her husband naturalizes after 1922, he could be a citizen and she's still not because of the way it worked. So I haven't tracked to see further, but what's interesting is this is only one page of this. Look at page 2. Names of her parents, her brothers and sisters, any relatives serving in the, U.S. Army, so her brother and nephews. She speaks English, all of this. And this picture, some of these pictures you can actually see. This one you can't happen to. But how's that for like just a quirk that, this is barely 100 years ago, just over 100 years. Then in World War II, you also had registrations. And I've showed you guys these before. These are at the Maine State Archives website under alien registrations. And basically everyone in the summer of 1940, if you were an adult living in the US, you were living in Maine, you had to register as an alien. And it wasn't as detailed as you got for Kansas 20 some years earlier, but you get where they're living. And again, this is the really big, important thing. You usually get a parish name or a town name or something more than just Quebec or New Brunswick, and an exact birth date. And because, and I think I said this to you guys in the immigration portion a couple weeks ago, because many of these were land border crossings, you don't get the detailed records you do for ship passenger lists. So that's why these are important for people in northern, especially. I mean, these are from all over the state. There are lots from Biddeford and Sanford and Lewiston, but there's also an awful lot of them from up in the county in northern Maine. So that's something to keep in mind. And actually, interestingly, in some of the towns, they ran out of the official form. See the nice logo and stuff? So they just did these on a piece of paper and sent them in. But you get the same. Now, this, unfortunately, you do not get more than New Brunswick. But you do get at least an exact birth date and an estimate of, he looks like he arrived around 1887. Has never made an application for citizenship, and he's been in the US 53 years. And this one, he's been in the US for 24 years. So if somebody ever tries to tell you that everybody naturalized as soon as they could, tell them you know otherwise. Because, as I said, a lot of these for Maine for 1940, it's people who've been here 20, 30, 40 years. And they came often as teenagers. It looks like to get work, and just never got around to naturalizing. So, and one final interesting tidbit, just to think about how things were different. You could travel outside the US without a passport for a good chunk of US history up until 1952. They offered passports. A lot of people got them, especially in the 20th century. But except for the Civil War, World War I, and World War II, in the 1880s, if you wanted to go to Europe, you didn't have to have a passport. It was probably reasonable and sensible to get one, but you didn't have to have it. So that's just something to keep in mind as a way of, of how things were done differently. In passport, many of the applications pre-World War I, pre-World War II are online at Ancestry. And they wouldn't, until the 20th century, they didn't have photographs. I've got one for a several greats uncle that is just, it's a sheet of paper with that same kind of description, physical description you saw on the naturalization petitions, not a picture. So just one way things have, in the past worked differently. I just wanted to drop that in so that you could see that as a way of helping your brain not have what's it called, recency bias. That the things that have happened more recently seem more important, bigger, more urgent, as opposed to earlier. But there's also recency bias in how we view records and documents. It's really easy to assume that the way things are done now is how they've always been done. So that's the end of the PowerPoint. Wow, I actually got this one done in 1 week, guys. Can you believe it? Now I need to find my toolbar. There it is. There we go. Turn my video back on. So, any questions on this?
Yes.
This
Okay.
one isn't so much a question as a comment. I noted that Stanislaus, who had to restart his process, he was identified as being from Russia, but the second attempt was Vilna. I believe that was Vilnius, Lithuania. So just something to note about these. Yeah,
But
it isn't always the government that you think.
Time of the USSR, by the 1930s. Wasn't Lithuania taken over by that point by my Eastern European geography gets a little shaky.
Yeah, Lithuania was governed by Russia at that point.
Yeah.
So
And
fair enough, that was the legal jurisdiction, but for someone who has
Yeah.
knows they have a Lithuanian ancestor, it's important to remember that the jurisdiction changed.
One of my favorite tools is the town find. If you're any of you who are dealing with Eastern European geography, even if you're not Jewish or your ancestors weren't Jewish, you want to look at the town finder at Jewish Gen, because it's got this great thing where you type in the best you know for the town and it'll give you all of the sound alikes. And then it will give you a column that's got the name of the town in Russian, in Polish, in Lithuania, in Yiddish, in Latvian, in Ukrainian, and then where it was, I think in 1900, then between the wars, and then in 1950, what its bigger jurisdiction was. And it's a really, you know, it's a really helpful database. So, and I have had, like, I've worked with people whose ancestors were Polish and Catholic, and we've been able to use it to figure out based on, the Polish versions they'd heard from their grandparents. And I've also used it with people who are Jewish, with the Yiddish version of the town and what it was. So if you've got Eastern European ancestry, the town finder at Jewish Gen is really helpful. Because it's not only dealing with the language variations, but how those borders changed. Um, and that yeah, I was interested. I meant to look further into that because it says present government of Russia on that one, but it really almost should have said the present government of the USSR. And I don't, you know, that's an interesting little twist. So, um, but yeah, just another way that the world has not always been the way we view it today. So,
I've got a question. Um, so I had an aunt that married a Greek, as she was born and raised in Maine. She married a Greek. She lost her citizenship. Then they divorced. Does she have to apply for citizenship again, or did the citizenship come back?
married between 1907 and 1922. After 1922, women did not lose their citizenship if they married a non-citizen.
Okay.
But in that, like, slightly less than 20-year period, um, you did. I don't have the answer on that. Um, I can see if I can find it for you. I have a couple books that have enough detail that I might have one that tells me. Because that is an interesting question.
And so my other question was, you said if you were a veteran and you fought for the Union, you didn't have to wait the 5 years for citizenship.
Right.
So are you saying that when you fought on the Union side and you were foreign born, did that kind of all coincide that you became a citizen of US?
Apply for it, but you didn't have to do the 5 years between the petition. It was more like 5 weeks to make sure that they.
Okay, gotcha.
And I don't know about World War II. I know World War I, there were also incentives for non-citizens to become citizens if they fought for the US.
Did any of that apply to your family if you fought in the war?
A young man who naturalized, his wife and minor children would then also be naturalized.
Okay.
Although in a lot of those cases, the kids would have been born here and so would not have needed to be naturalized. Although they may still, in some cases, as you saw, have been listed on the petition. They didn't need to be, because if they were born here, they were citizens.
Right. Okay. Gotcha.
Okay, let me stop the recording.